After going to a hospital and being treated by a black female doctor, a patient refuses the care, insinuating that he wants to be treated by a more appropriate doctor rather than someone of her color. But then this happens. Betty was born into a humble family and grew up in a neighborhood with few opportunities. From an early age, her parents encouraged education, believing it was the only path to a better life. Motivated by the lack of healthcare in her community, Betty decided to study medicine, with the support of her parents, who made many sacrifices for her to have access to education. She was the first in her family to enter medical school and faced challenges but managed to graduate and specialize. Now, as a doctor, she is dedicated to treating her patients with professionalism and respect at the hospital where she works. The day began early for Betty. At the first beep of the alarm clock, she opened her eyes, feeling the familiar anxiety before a long shift. Next to her, William was still sleeping, and she took those seconds of silence to breathe deeply. She got up, took a quick shower, and headed to the kitchen, where the aroma of coffee that William had prepared already filled the air. "Good morning, most dedicated doctor in this country," William said with a smile, placing a mug of coffee on the table. Betty smiled and rolled her eyes. "Good morning, over the top." "I'm far from that, but I appreciate the compliment," she replied, sitting next to him and grabbing a piece of bread to spread butter on. William laughed and watched her closely. "You know, I think you really believe you're not all that, but I know it's not easy doing what you do every day." "I love what I do, William. Even on the tough days, I know I'm where I should be," Betty said, reflecting on her husband's words. He held her hand and squeezed it gently. "I just worry you're wearing yourself out, Betty. Those shifts are tiring. When was the last time you took an entire weekend off?" She let out a light laugh. "William, you know that whenever I try, some urgent case pops up, a patient that needs me. And how could I say no? Tomorrow, I have an appointment with that 89-year-old lady who came from the countryside, remember?" William sighed, resigned. "Yeah, I remember her. You talk about your patients with so much affection that as much as I want to complain, all I can do is support you." Betty smiled and took another sip of coffee, savoring that moment of peace. They finished breakfast amidst laughter and conversation until she glanced at the clock. "I need to go, love. Wish me luck for my shift." "Good luck, doctor. And call me if you need anything, okay?" She got up, kissed him, and grabbed her car keys. "I promise. I love you. See you later." On her way to the hospital, Betty listened to one of her favorite songs, letting it carry her as she thought about the day ahead. Upon arrival, she parked, took a deep breath once more, and headed to the entrance, where she found a few colleagues already gathered in the lobby. "Good morning, Betty," exclaimed Scott, a nurse who always had a joke ready. "Good morning, Scott. Ready for another long day?" Betty asked, already anticipating some playful response. He smiled and said, "Ready. That depends on how much coffee you let me drink today." Before Betty could reply, another colleague, Stephanie, approached. "Coffee? More coffee? Scott, if you take another sip, you'll start talking faster than we can keep up." Betty burst into laughter. "You two make me start my shift with a smile, at least." They walked together to the emergency department, where Betty changed into her coat, organized some charts, and prepared to see the first patients. In no time, she was immersed in her work, with the focus and calmness that always characterized her. The first patient of the day was an elderly gentleman who complained of persistent chest pain. Betty greeted him and began to ask some questions. "How are you, sir?" she asked, reviewing his history. "Oh, doctor, I've been better, you know. The pain has been bothering me for days, and my wife is worried it might be something serious," he replied with an anxious expression. Betty smiled, trying to calm him. "We're going to run some tests, sir. It might be something simple, but it's always good to check. Health is our most precious asset." He nodded, visibly relieved. "You're right, doctor. I should have come sooner, but you know how it is, we keep putting things off." After examining him, Betty moved on to the next patient, a young woman who had fallen while exercising. She complained of ankle pain. "I need you to tell me exactly how the fall happened," said Betty, as she assessed the painful area. "Well, I was trying a new move at the gym, doctor. But I guess my ankle didn't like the idea," the young woman said, laughing at herself. Betty laughed too. "Sometimes our bodies let us know we're not ready. We'll take an X-ray to ensure nothing serious happened, but at first glance, it seems like just a sprain." And so the shift went on, with treatments, guidance, and some informal chats with patients. Betty stood out for her calmness and patience in attending to each one, never showing haste, even though the hospital was busy. Later, while organizing some charts, she saw a man enter through the emergency door. He was alone, walking hesitantly, as if he were conflicted about asking for help or not. Betty observed him for a moment before approaching, noting his face marked by an expression of discomfort and distrust. Betty took a deep breath and walked toward the man who had just entered. He had a closed expression and crossed arms, clearly showing he wasn't there by choice. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you?" Betty asked, keeping a gentle and professional tone. Frank looked her up and down, with a distrustful expression. Only if there's no one else around," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. "I'm Dr. Betty. I'm in charge of this shift today," she said, extending her hand politely. "If you need treatment, I'm here to help." Frank didn't return the gesture and made a grimace. "Doctor? I prefer to wait for a real doctor." Betty held back her reaction. It wasn't the first time she encountered patients who, for various reasons, hesitated to be treated by her. Calmly, she explained, "Sir, right now, I'm the only doctor available for immediate care. And the sooner we assess you, the better." Frank paused, looking away and shaking his head. "This is absurd. Having to be treated by someone of your color." Betty maintained her composure but decided to insist once more. "The priority here is your health, sir. I can assure you that I'm here to help and will do my best." He remained silent for a few seconds, seeming to struggle with an internal battle. Finally, he said irritably, "I prefer to wait for another shift. Maybe even until tomorrow, if that's the case." "If that's how you prefer, I respect your decision," Betty said, trying to hide her discomfort. "But please consider that your condition may worsen." Frank scoffed. "Yeah, I'll consider it," he replied curtly. He turned to leave, as if to prove something to himself. Betty watched him walk away, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. She knew that patients like Frank were, in part, a reflection of the barriers still present in society. Prejudice, although subtle for some, was painfully evident in situations like that. However, her duty was to respect his choice, even if that meant seeing someone reject help for reasons unrelated to medicine. Minutes later, when she returned to her post, Betty found Scott, the nurse, organizing charts. He looked at her and noticed her expression. "Is everything okay, Betty?" he asked, in a more serious tone than usual. "Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think about how tiring prejudice can be, you know," she replied hesitantly. Scott nodded. "The man who just left, right?" He seemed uncomfortable from the moment he walked in. Betty sighed. "Yeah, he clearly didn't want to be treated by me." Scott, trying to lighten the moment, said, "You know, if he comes back, I'll tell him there's no better option than Dr. Betty." Betty smiled, appreciating the gesture. "Thanks, Scott, but I think some people need more time to understand certain things." The shift continued, and Betty resumed her treatments, trying to leave the episode behind. However, hours later, when the activity in the emergency room had slowed down, she noticed a familiar figure entering through the door. It was Frank, but this time he looked somewhat pale and walked with difficulty, clutching his chest as if he were in intense pain. Betty immediately approached, concerned. "Sir, what happened? Are you feeling something more serious?" Frank avoided looking her in the eyes but replied with difficulty, "The pain has gotten worse. I need help." He seemed reluctant to admit it, but the discomfort was evident. "Let's do an evaluation right now," Betty said without hesitation. "Please, come with me to the treatment room." Frank nodded, still avoiding eye contact, but followed Betty's steps toward the exam room. He sat on the examination table, arms crossed, looking around disdainfully while she prepared the equipment. The tension in the room was palpable. "Is this really happening?" he murmured in a harsh voice, almost talking to himself. "Do I have to be treated by someone, like you?" Betty paused what she was doing for a moment, trying to remain calm. "Sir, I'm the doctor available right now. I'm here to help." Frank scoffed, looking away. "Look, I don't know what's worse, this pain or having to be treated by someone of your color." Betty felt a pang in her chest, as if each of his words was a blow. She tried to swallow the lump forming in her throat, but his words continued to spill out, laden with prejudice. "It's like no one respects anything in this country anymore," he continued, shaking his head. "You know, I said it before, I didn't want to be treated by you. I only came back because I really felt I needed to. But if I had known, maybe I would have stayed home." With her voice choked, Betty took a deep breath and said, "I'll step out for a moment, sir. I'll need a few minutes before we continue." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the room, feeling her eyes well up. She walked quickly through the corridors to the area where her colleagues were gathered, trying to compose herself. Upon seeing her, Scott immediately noticed her downcast expression. "Betty, are you okay?" he asked, concerned, as the other colleagues around also approached, realizing something serious had happened. Betty held back her tears and replied in a wavering tone. "It's complicated. I'm dealing with a patient who is being very difficult." Stephanie, another colleague, gently touched her arm. "Do you want to tell us what happened? It seems like it was something more serious." Betty took a deep breath, struggling to maintain control over her emotions. "It's a patient who refused to be treated by me from the beginning. When he came in the first time, he made it clear he wouldn't accept treatment from someone of my color." She paused, feeling the weight of the words as her colleagues exchanged looks of indignation. "Now he's back, with more pain, but still refuses to accept that I'm the doctor who can help him." Scott crossed his arms, visibly irritated. "That's unacceptable, Betty. We can't let a patient treat you like that. He needs a wake-up call." Another colleague agreed. "That's right, Scott. Let's go there and give him a lesson on respect." Betty shook her head, still controlling her breathing to keep from crying. "No, please. Don't do that. I know he's being prejudiced, but in the end, he's a patient. It's my job to help him, regardless of how he treats me." Stephanie looked at her in disbelief. "Betty, he humiliated you. You don't have to go through this. No one here judges you if you decide not to treat him." Betty gave a faint smile, though the discomfort was still evident on her face. "I appreciate the support, Stephanie. Really. But I chose this profession knowing there would be challenges. And unfortunately, prejudice is one of them. If I give up now, I won't be helping those who really need it. What I can do is go back there and give my best, no matter how difficult it is." Scott sighed, shaking his head in resignation. "You're way more patient than I would be, Betty. But, look, we're all here to support you. Just call if you need anything." Betty nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for her colleagues. "Thank you, everyone. I just wanted you to know what I'm dealing with, and it's good to know you understand." She paused, catching her breath. "I'll go back there and continue the treatment. He's a patient and needs help, even if he doesn't see that right now." Stephanie held her shoulder, giving a supportive squeeze. "We're with you, Betty. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to call." With one last deep breath, Betty stepped away from the group and returned to the exam room, feeling strengthened by her colleague's words. Betty entered the exam room again, her demeanor firmer. She knew it would be a challenge, but she was determined to fulfill her duty with the same dedication as always. Frank, upon seeing her return, let out a sigh of irritation, as if her presence there was an unbearable nuisance. "So, are you really going to treat me?" he murmured, crossing his arms with a look of disdain. "Yes, sir. I'm the doctor in charge of this shift and I'm here to provide treatment," Betty replied, with a controlled tone, without looking away. Frank looked to the side, clearly uncomfortable. "I'd prefer if someone more suitable were here." "I understand you might have your preferences," said Betty, keeping calm. "But right now, I'm the only doctor available for emergency treatment." He scoffed, casting a disdainful look. "Suitable? That's the least I expected," he grumbled. "Look, I don't even know if it's worth it. Maybe it would have been better to stay home, enduring this pain than having to go through this." Betty took a deep breath, determined not to let his words shake her. She focused on the task at hand, adjusting her stethoscope and checking his vital signs. "Sir, we need to ensure there's no more serious compromise in your health status," she said calmly. "It's incredible," he continued, as if he couldn't help himself. "I didn't think the hospital was so desperate that it would, well, have anyone attend to me." Those words echoed in the silence of the room. Betty felt the weight of humiliation but continued to maintain a firm expression. "Sir, I'm asking you to please trust the care I'm providing," she said, trying to keep her composure while checking the tests. He seemed ready to continue his derogatory comments, but suddenly, a new wave of pain crossed his body. He groaned, bringing his hand to his chest. "Doctor, it hurts," he said, his voice faltering. The discomfort seemed real, and for a moment, Frank appeared unable to continue his complaints. Betty rushed over, performing some maneuvers to alleviate the pressure on his chest. "It's important that you stay calm now," she said, keeping her focus on the treatment. "This pain might be a sign that we need to act quickly." He looked confused, perhaps scared, but said nothing more. The chest pain seemed to bring a new dimension to the situation, and Frank finally began to realize the severity of what he was facing. The following minutes were marked by tense silence. Betty worked focused, monitoring every detail while performing the necessary procedure. She felt the intensity of the situation and knew the moment was crucial for stabilizing him. After the initial tests and procedures, Betty stepped away to record the data. Frank remained silent, but his face still bore a trace of distrust and reluctance. She noticed that although he had stopped the comments, likely due to the pain, the look of disdain had not disappeared. While Betty made the notes, Frank shot a direct look at her, not hiding his irritation. "Don't think this changes anything," he murmured, his voice still filled with hostility. She took a deep breath, keeping her focus on what she was doing. "My only goal is to take care of your health, sir," she replied, maintaining a professional and distant tone. He let out a dry laugh that quickly turned into a faint groan of pain. "If I had another option, I would have been out of here long ago. But it seems that today luck is not on my side." Betty chose not to respond, focusing on recording the symptoms and warning signs. His condition was worse than she had initially anticipated, and the delay in the initial treatment might have aggravated complications. Frank continued to watch her, his eyes half closed, as if trying to endure the pain while also holding back from making further comments. "Doctor, so what? Is it done yet? I want to know what's really going on," he asked, with an impatient expression. "We need a few more tests for a complete evaluation," Betty replied. "And to stabilize you before taking any additional measures. Your health is at risk, and any delay could complicate things further." Frank rolled his eyes. "This is all a consequence of having to wait for decent treatment here." Betty pressed her lips together, trying to ignore the comment. We'll start a treatment to control the pain and stabilize your vital signs." He sighed, begrudgingly, and looked up at the ceiling. "And here I am, depending on you." For a moment, Betty felt the pressure of his words like an invisible barrier. But she knew that as a doctor, her obligation was to treat any patient, regardless of the circumstances. She focused on finishing the report and prepared to administer the initial medication. As she adjusted the four, Frank murmured, "This is absurd. If I weren't in pain, would have left a long time ago." Betty tried to remain calm, ignoring his tone. "We're doing everything we can to reduce your pain and stabilize you." Frank glanced at his wristwatch, restless, as if counting the minutes. The silence was interrupted by the monitor, which began indicating some irregularities in his heartbeats. Betty furrowed her brow, realizing the situation was worsening. "Sir, I'll need to monitor you closely. The condition is deteriorating, and we need to act quickly," she said, while adjusting some of the parameters on the monitor. He just nodded, visibly tired and irritated. "Yeah, the price of a failed system," he murmured, as if lost in his thoughts. Minutes later, the situation intensified. Frank began to show signs of difficulty breathing, and his face paled even more. Betty immediately called the support team, and other doctors and nurses entered the room to assist in the emergency procedure. As they tried to stabilize him, Betty realized the situation was more serious than initially predicted. The delay in treatment had compromised vital functions, and Frank was now in a critical state. The team did everything they could, but Betty knew from experience that the chances of recovery were quickly diminishing. Frank's breathing became increasingly irregular, and the monitors began to emit constant alarms. Betty, with absolute concentration, tried every possible maneuver, but Frank's body wasn't responding to the treatments as expected. Shortly afterward, the monitor showed a flat line. Betty felt a knot in her throat at the confirmation of the worst outcome. After the last attempt at resuscitation, she finally stepped away, taking a deep breath to maintain her composure. Silence filled the room, and the medical team exchanged glances, respecting that difficult moment. Betty closed her eyes for a second, allowing herself to feel the sadness over the outcome, but soon regained her posture and faced reality again. "Betty, you did everything you could," Scott said, who had entered to help in the last moments and was now placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "I know," she replied softly. "But it's hard to see someone refuse help until the last moment out of prejudice." Scott shook his head, still frustrated with the whole situation. "Maybe someone like him dying isn't such a bad thing, Betty. The world doesn't lose much with people like that." Betty turned to him immediately, with a firm and disapproving look. "Scott, as someone who saves lives, you shouldn't say that," she said in a calm but firm tone. "All lives are equal. Even those of people like Frank. I did everything within my power to save him, just as I would for any other patient. And now, even after everything he said and did, I feel sad for the loss." Scott seemed to realize the gravity of her words. He lowered his gaze, embarrassed, and sighed. "Sorry, Betty. What I said was wrong. I think, what you had to face today affected me too, and I ended up saying something foolish." She nodded, softening her look. "I understand, Scott. It was a tough situation for all of us." She lightly touched his arm, conveying genuine compassion. "But we need to remember that our job is to care for every life, regardless of who is on the other side. That's the oath we took." He nodded, still looking down. "Thank you, Betty. I promise I'll think more before I speak." The shift finally ended, and Betty, exhausted, changed her clothes and grabbed her things. On the way home, the emotional fatigue weighed as heavily as the physical. Frank's words, the outcome of that situation, everything still echoed in her mind. When she got home, she was greeted by her husband, William, who immediately noticed the tired look on her face. "Hi, love. How are you? You look exhausted." Betty tried to smile, but her eyes still reflected the weight of the day. "It was a tough shift," she replied, as she sat next to him on the couch. She looked at her hands as if trying to find the right words. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" William asked, with the gentle tone of someone ready to listen to everything, without rush. Betty took a deep breath before beginning. "I had a patient today. Frank. He was extremely prejudiced from the moment he entered the hospital. He refused treatment because of who I am. Because of my color. He came back later when the pain worsened, but he remained hostile throughout the treatment. He only accepted help because he was in so much pain." William watched her closely, and his expression hardened as he listened to her words. "And then? I did everything I could for him. But his condition was already very advanced when he came back. If he had accepted treatment earlier, maybe he would have survived." Betty looked down, and her hands trembled slightly. "Deep down, I know it wasn't my fault, but I still feel a pang of guilt." William placed a hand over hers, squeezing it gently. "Betty, you did everything within your power. You know that. He made his decisions, and those decisions brought consequences. You're not responsible for his refusal." She felt her eyes welling up, and a tear rolled down her face. "Yeah, I know. But as a doctor, we feel it's our responsibility to save every life. It doesn't matter what he said or did. I wish he had accepted help from the beginning. Maybe he would still be here." William hugged her, pulling her close to his chest. "Love, you did more than many would. Even in the face of prejudice, you acted with humanity and did everything you could. That says much more about you than about him." Betty cried silently, allowing herself to feel the weight of the situation while William held her with patience and understanding. "You're an amazing person, Betty. And it's precisely your empathy that makes you such a dedicated doctor. Even today, after everything, you care. That's all anyone could ask of a professional." She lifted her gaze, wiping her tears. "Thank you, William. I just needed to hear that." She sighed, feeling a lightness beginning to take over, as if his support helped her carry that weight. They remained there in silence, holding each other on the couch. Betty knew that the day would be marked in her memory, but she also knew she had given her all. And deep down, she recognized that her commitment to medicine went beyond any barrier, beyond any prejudice. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.